She cursed the Mafia boss in Sicilian. He looked at her and grinned. Say that again. The wine arrived before Sofia could stop it. She had not ordered it. She had not asked for it. The waiter set it down with the careful movements of a man who had been told to be careful, and when she looked up at him with a question already forming on her lips, he gave a small nod toward the table beside her and walked away before she could say a single word. Sofia looked at the wine, then she looked at the table beside her. There were 4 men seated there. 3 of them were watching the room the way soldiers watch a field, without blinking, without eating, without doing anything that might look like distraction. The 4th had his back to her. He was the only one with food in front of him. He was the only one eating. She looked back at the wine. It was a good bottle. She could see that from where she sat. The label was old and the color through the glass was deep, and whoever had sent it clearly knew something about wine that went beyond reading a menu. That was not the point. The point was that she had not asked for it, and she was not the kind of woman who accepted things she had not asked for. And she had been sitting alone in this restaurant in Milan for 40 minutes, waiting for a man named Colin, who was already 38 minutes late, and her patience had run out somewhere around minute 20. She pushed the glass to the edge of the table. The waiter reappeared. He looked at the glass. He looked at her. He had the expression of a man caught between 2 people and desperately hoping someone would give him a direction. She told him, politely and in Italian, to return it with her thanks. He went back to the other table. She watched him lean down and speak quietly to the man with his back to her. The man did not turn around. He did not react in any visible way. He simply lifted one hand, a small, slow gesture, and the waiter straightened and walked away with the bottle still in his hands. The wine came back. It was placed in front of her again with the same careful movements, as if nothing had happened, as if the whole exchange had not just occurred 10 feet away in plain sight. Sofia looked at the bottle for a long moment. Then she looked at the man with his back to her. He was still eating. He was not watching her. He was talking quietly to the man on his left, and the conversation looked like business, and he had the posture of someone who had simply decided the matter was settled. This was the moment. She understood it later, how this was the exact moment everything began, and how if she had simply left the wine there, simply ignored it, and waited for Colin and eaten her meal and gone back to her hotel, none of what followed would have happened. She did not leave the wine there. She said something, quietly, to no one in particular, to the air, the way her grandmother used to speak, under her breath, in the old dialect, the one that was not quite Italian and not quite anything else, the one from a village in the interior of Sicily that was so specific and so rural that even most Sicilians would have trouble following it. Her grandmother had spent 40 years in New Jersey speaking it to herself in the kitchen, a running commentary on the world delivered in a language the world could not understand. Sofia had grown up hearing it. She had absorbed it the way children absorb things, without studying, without trying, simply by sitting at a kitchen table for enough years. It lived in her mouth the way childhood lives in the body, not thought about, just there. What she said was not kind. It was the kind of thing a Sicilian grandmother says about a man who has overstepped, the kind of assessment that is more archaeology than insult, that digs up everything a person is and holds it to the light without ceremony. She said it quietly, and she said it to herself, and she absolutely did not intend for anyone to hear it. The table beside her went quiet, not gradually, all at once. The 3 men who had been watching the room with soldier eyes all shifted their gaze to her at the same moment, and the quality of the silence that followed was so specific and so sudden that Sofia felt it the way you feel a temperature drop, in your skin, before you register it in your mind. The man with his back to her stopped eating. He set down his fork. He picked up the cloth napkin from his lap, pressed it once to his mouth, and set it on the table beside his plate. Then he turned in his chair, slowly, the way people turn when they are not afraid of what they are turning toward. He looked at her. He was not what she expected. She did not know what she had expected, but it was not this. A man in his early 40s, with a face that was unremarkable at first glance, and then, in the space of 2 seconds, became the most specific face she had ever looked at. Dark eyes, a jaw that looked like it had made decisions, hair that had started to go silver at the sides. He was not trying to be anything in particular, and that, she realized, was the thing that made him impossible to look away from. He looked at her for a moment that stretched long enough to be deliberate. Then he smiled. Not a polite smile. Not the smile of a man who found her amusing. It was slower than that, and more careful than that, and it reached his eyes in a way that made her feel, for one cold and specific second, that he had just read something she had written about herself in private. He said 2 words, in the same dialect, her grandmother's dialect. The village dialect that 4,000 people in the world still spoke. Say that again. Sophia did not say it again. She picked up the glass of wine, and she drank from it, because it was the only thing she could think to do with her hands, and because standing up and leaving in that moment felt like exactly the wrong kind of movement, and because the wine, as it turned out, was extraordinary, warm and old, and tasting of somewhere specific, somewhere with red soil and summer heat and old stone walls. She set the glass down. She looked at the wall across from her. She had been in difficult rooms before. She had sat in courtrooms translating testimony for people who were afraid, in hospital corridors interpreting diagnoses that changed lives, in boardrooms where no one in the building shared a language, and she was the only thread holding the conversation together. She was not a woman who was easily rattled. This was a thing she knew about herself. She was rattled. The man turned back to his table. He picked up his fork. He resumed eating as though nothing had happened, and the 3 men who had gone still resumed watching the room, and the restaurant noise came back up gradually, like sound returning after a pressure change. Sophia sat with her wine. Colin arrived 11 minutes later, breathless and apologetic, and carrying a leather bag that he kept checking as though something inside it might have shifted. He was 31 years old, with sandy hair, and the look of a man who had been running for a while, and had not had time to stop and think about it. He worked in logistics. That was how she knew him, through a conference in Brussels, 2 years ago, a conversation over bad coffee that had turned into a professional contact she used occasionally when her translation work overlapped with shipping paperwork. She liked Colin. He was straightforward. He said what he meant and meant what he said, and he was late because he was genuinely terrible at reading departure boards, which was a flaw she found more endearing than she probably should have. He sat down and immediately noticed the wine. He looked at the bottle, then at her, then at the table beside her, which was now empty, cleared, as though the 4 men had simply dissolved while she was watching the door, and then back at her again. "That's a serious bottle," he said. "Yes," she said. "Did you order it?" "No." He waited for more. She did not offer more. She picked up the menu instead, and they ordered dinner, and they talked about the contract she was in Milan to review, shipping documents that needed to move between 3 languages, without losing a specific legal meaning that only existed in one of them. It was the kind of problem she was good at. It was the kind of conversation that usually steadied her. She was only half present for it. The other half of her was sitting with those 2 words. The dialect, his voice, the way he had turned in his chair without any hurry whatsoever, as if time had agreed in advance to wait for him. She did not know his name yet. She did not know who he was yet. She knew only that he had heard her, the real her, the kitchen table her, the her that existed in a language nobody used, and that instead of pretending otherwise, he had answered, and that he had smiled like a man who had been waiting a long time for exactly that sentence. She finished the wine, all of it, because it was extraordinary, and because she had earned it, and because somewhere in the back of her mind, in the part that dealt with things honestly, she already understood that something had started, something she had not chosen, and had not planned, and had not seen coming. Her grandmother had a saying for moments like this, a short one, in the dialect. It translated, roughly, to, "The fish does not see the net until it is already inside it." Sophia had always thought that was a warning. She was beginning to think it might be something else. Colin called her at 7 the next morning. She had been awake since 5. She was sitting in the hotel chair by the window, with the city still gray outside, and a cup of coffee going cold on the side table. And when his name came up on her phone, she answered it on the second ring, because something in his voice, even in that single second of ringtone, told her this was not the kind of call you let go to voicemail. He was not breathless this time. That was the first thing she noticed. Colin was always a little breathless, always moving slightly faster than the moment required, always carrying the energy of a man who had arrived somewhere just in time. This morning he was still. The stillness was not natural to him, and that made it worse. "I need to tell you something," he said. She waited. "The man at the table last night. The one who sent the wine." She kept her voice flat. "What about him?" There was a pause, not a long one. The kind of pause that is not about finding words, but about deciding how many of them to use. "His name is Dante Mancuso," Colin said. She did not recognize the name immediately. Then she did. Not from news, not from any headline she could place exactly, from the way the name landed. Some names arrive in a room and change the temperature. This was one of those names. "How do you know him?" she said. Another pause. "Sophia," he said. "The contract you are here to review. The shipping documents." She was already sitting up straighter. She said nothing. She let the silence do the work, because that was what you did when someone was trying to tell you something they were not sure how to say. You gave them the space, and let them find the edge of it. "He owns the company," Colin said. She looked out the window at the gray Milan sky. A pigeon landed on the ledge and regarded her with the complete indifference of a creature that had never had a complicated morning in its life. "You brought me here to review contracts for a man you did not tell me about," she said. Not a question, just a statement, laid flat on the table between them. "I did not know he would be at the restaurant," Colin said quickly. "That was not planned. He doesn't typically come to Milan this time of year. And I thought—" He stopped, restarted. "I thought the contract was just a contract." "Is it?" Silence. "Colin, I don't know anymore," he said, and the honesty in it was so complete and so plainly frightened that she believed him. Colin was not a man built for deception. He could not even lie about why he was late for dinner without his face giving him away. She asked him to send her everything he had, every document, every correspondence, every file that connected her name to this contract and this company. He said he would. He sounded relieved to have something concrete to do. She hung up and looked at the cold coffee and did not drink it. She spent the next 4 hours reading. The company was called Mancuso Group, which was not a subtle name, and it had been operating for 31 years, which meant it had been operating longer than she had been alive. On paper, it was a shipping and logistics company with a real estate arm and 3 registered charitable foundations. It had offices in Palermo, Naples, Milan, Marseille, and 1 registered address in London that appeared in a footnote and was never mentioned again. Its legal filings were immaculate. Its tax records were available and correct and boring in the way that things are boring when a great deal of effort has gone into making them boring. She found 2 mentions of Dante Mancuso in the Italian business press over the past 10 years. Both were brief. One mentioned him in connection with a port development project in Palermo that had received government backing. The other was a brief note in a logistics industry publication about the acquisition of a smaller Greek shipping company. In both articles, he was described as the founder and chairman. In neither article was there a photograph. She found nothing else, which was, she understood, itself a piece of information. Men who ran companies at this level and left almost no public record were not simply private. They were intentional. There was a difference. She closed her laptop and sat with what she knew. She was in Milan to review contracts for a company owned by a man who had heard her curse him in a 4,000-person dialect at a restaurant last night, who had smiled at her like he was not surprised, and who had, according to Colin, not been expected to be in Milan at all. She thought about that last part for a long time. She ordered breakfast from room service. The bread was excellent. She ate it standing by the window, watching the city wake up, running the sequence of the previous evening through her mind one more time. The wine arriving, the exchange with the waiter, the things she had said under her breath, the silence that followed, the way he had turned. The way he had turned. That was the part that kept stopping her. Not the smile, the turn, the complete, total absence of hurry in it. As though he had been in the middle of something important and had paused it not because he felt threatened or provoked, but because something interesting had just happened, and he wanted to look at it properly. She had translated for enough people in enough rooms to read the language of body without effort. Power showed itself in how people moved before they spoke. And the way Dante Mancuso had turned in that chair was the movement of a man who had not been afraid of anything in a very long time. She was not afraid either. This she checked honestly, the way she checked difficult things, directly, without looking away. She examined the feeling in her chest and in her stomach and in the back of her throat, and she could not find fear. What she found instead was something more alert than fear, sharper. The feeling she got when a translation problem was harder than it looked, and she had not yet found the right word, and could feel it somewhere just beyond her reach. She had a flight home to New York in 3 days. She had a contract to review. She got dressed and went to the offices of Mancuso Group's Milan representative, which were on the 4th floor of a building near the Duomo that smelled of stone and old money. And she sat at a conference table, and the documents were brought to her, and she read them with the attention she brought to every piece of text she touched, line by line, word by word, understanding that language was never only what it said, but also what it had been built to obscure. The documents were clean, professionally drafted, correctly translated from Italian into English, without the small structural tells that showed up when someone was hiding something in the language. She had spent 12 years looking for those tells. She was good at finding them. These were not there. She made her notes. She marked 3 places where the English phrasing needed adjustment, not because it was incorrect, but because the legal weight of the word sat differently in English than it had in Italian, and a court would read it differently. She wrote her recommendations. She was thorough. She was professional. She was exactly who she had been paid to be. She was also thinking about the village. The dialect her grandmother had spoken was from a place called Mazzarino, a small town in the province of Caltanissetta, in the interior of the island. Not a coastal town. Not a town that showed up in travel articles. A place of yellow stone and dry hills, and the particular stubbornness of people who have lived for centuries at a distance from everything. Her grandmother, Concetta, had left at 22. She had never gone back. She had never explained why she had never gone back. She had simply lived in New Jersey and raised children and cooked things that took all day and spoken to herself in the kitchen in a dialect that her own children could understand but could not quite produce. And Sophia had absorbed it from the kitchen table the same way she had absorbed everything, quietly, completely, without ever being asked. She had never in her adult life heard anyone outside her family use it. She finished her review at 3:30. She thanked the representative, a man named Owen who had the very correct manners of someone who had been specifically trained in very correct manners. He thanked her. He handed her an envelope. Inside was a card, heavy paper, with a handwritten address on it, and 3 words beneath. Dinner. Tonight, 8. No name, no signature. The handwriting was confident and unhurried, which she was beginning to think was simply how this man did everything. Owen was looking out the window with the careful expression of a man pretending not to be part of this moment. She looked at the card for a long time. She thought about her grandmother, about the kitchen, about the particular sound of Sicilian spoken by someone who did not know they were being heard. She put the card in her pocket. She went back to her hotel, and she sat on the edge of the bed, and she called her friend Nina, who was a lawyer in New York, and who had the useful quality of never wasting time being shocked by anything. "Tell me everything you can find about a company called Mancuso Group," Sophia said. "Shipping. Based in Palermo. Chairman named Dante Mancuso." There was a brief pause. "How quickly do you need this?" Nina said. "Before 8 tonight." Another pause. Shorter this time. Nina was already typing. "I'll call you in 2 hours," she said. She called in 90 minutes. What she had found was not so much information as the shape of information, the outline of a thing that was not fully visible. The company was real and its filings were clean, and its foundations were registered and legitimate. There were things in the business press, old things, from 20 years ago, that suggested connections to men and organizations that most people chose not to look at directly. But 20 years was a long time, and nothing in the past decade linked Dante Mancuso directly to anything that a careful, competent lawyer could put her finger on. "He is either completely legitimate," Nina said, or he is very good at looking it. Which do you think? Both can be true, Nina said. Sophia, what are you doing? I have not decided yet, Sophia said honestly. That is not reassuring. I know. She showered. She changed into something that was neither overdressed nor careless. She told herself she was going because it was professional, and because the contract required follow-up, and because refusing would create a complication she did not need. She went because she wanted to. The address was a restaurant in the Brera district. Small, quiet, the kind of place that did not have its menu on any app or website. The kind of place that existed for people who already knew where it was. He was already there when she arrived. He was not surrounded by men this time. There was one person at a table near the door, a man who looked at her when she entered, and then looked away, which was its own kind of watching. But Dante Mancuso himself was alone at a corner table, with a single candle, and no wine ordered yet, and an expression on his face that was, she realized as she sat down across from him, the expression of a person who is genuinely pleased, not performing pleasure, not being polite, actually pleased. You came, he said, in English, perfect English, with the faintest trace of an accent she would have needed several more sentences to precisely place. You didn't ask, she said. You told. He looked at her for a moment. Then he smiled, the same smile as the night before, slow and reaching his eyes, and carrying something inside it that she still could not quite name. Yes, he said, I did. I apologize. She had not expected the apology. It landed oddly. Not because it seemed false. It did not seem false. It seemed like a man who had noticed something and corrected it without any particular drama. The way you adjust a thing that is slightly off without making a production of adjusting it. You speak English well, she said. 7 languages, he said. English, Italian, French, Spanish, German, Arabic, and one other. She knew which one the 7th was before he said it. He said it anyway, in the dialect. A simple sentence, the kind of thing you say to open a door. Something in her chest moved in a way she was not entirely prepared for. It was not romantic, or not only romantic. It was more like the feeling of hearing a piece of music you learned as a child and had not heard since. The recognition was physical before it was emotional. She answered him, in the same dialect, in her grandmother's voice, almost. He leaned forward very slightly, and for the first time since she had watched him turn in his chair, she saw something cross his face that was not composure. It was brief, and it was quickly recovered, but it was there. It looked like relief. The waiter came. Dante ordered in Italian, without looking at the menu, and she noticed he ordered for himself, and waited for her to order for herself, rather than assuming, which she also had not expected, and she thought, this is a man full of things I have not expected, which is either interesting or dangerous, and quite possibly both. The food arrived and they ate and they talked. About logistics, about the contract, about the Italian phrasing she had flagged, and why it mattered in an English legal context. He followed her reasoning with complete attention. He asked precise questions. He understood the answers without needing them simplified. This also was not what she had expected. He was not performing intelligence. He was simply intelligent, the way some people simply are, without needing to make any announcement about it. She was 2 glasses of wine in, and the conversation had moved to languages in general, to translation as a discipline, to the question of whether it was ever truly possible to carry a meaning from one language to another without losing something, when he said the thing that changed the whole evening. He said quietly, looking at the table rather than at her, My grandmother was from Mazzarino. Sophia set her glass down. She looked at him. He looked back at her. So was mine, she said. The candle between them was very small, and the restaurant was very quiet, and outside Milan was doing what Milan did in the evenings. Moving, always moving, full of its own business. And inside this small corner nothing moved at all for a moment that lasted precisely long enough. I know, he said. She felt the air change again. That same temperature drop she had felt in the restaurant the night before, when the silence at his table had come down all at once. How, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I looked. 2 words. Delivered the same way he delivered everything. Without drama. Without apology. With the simple directness of a man stating a fact. He had looked. He had found out. He had known before she walked into this restaurant tonight exactly who she was and where her family was from. She should have stood up. She understood this. Every reasonable part of her knew this was the moment to stand up. She picked up her wine instead. She was thinking about her grandmother, about the kitchen in New Jersey, and the sound of that dialect moving through the air of that house like weather. Like something you could not keep out. Like the way certain things get into you before you are old enough to decide whether you want them. She was thinking about what it meant that this man, this specific, careful, unhurried man, had grown up with the same sounds in his house, the same words, the same particular music of a place neither of them had ever lived in but both of them carried. She passed 6 years ago, he said, still looking at the table. My grandmother. I know what that is, Sophia said quietly. He looked up. She had not meant to say that with as much feeling as she said it. It came out of the real part of her, the unguarded part, the kitchen table part. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he refilled her glass, quietly, without asking, but not the way the wine had been sent over the night before, not as a gesture of authority, as something else, something smaller and more careful. And she let him. Which was, she would think later, the moment she stopped pretending she did not know exactly where this was going. She did not go home to New York in 3 days. She told herself she would decide in the morning. She told herself this at 11 that night, in the taxi back to her hotel, and at midnight, when she was sitting on the edge of the bed still in her clothes, and at 2 in the morning, when she finally admitted she was not going to sleep, and made coffee from the in-room machine, and sat by the window, watching the city do the slow, quiet work it did, when most people were not watching. She called Nina at 7. I need to change my flight, she said. There was a pause that contained a very large amount of information. To when? Nina said. I don't know yet. The pause extended. Sophia, Nina said carefully. Tell me about dinner. She told her. Not everything. Enough. The grandmother from Mazzarino. The dialect. The look on his face when she answered him in it. The way he had said he had looked into her family before she walked through the door. When she finished, Nina was quiet for a moment. He researched you, Nina said. Yes. Before you arrived. Yes. And you're staying. It was not a question exactly. It was the way Nina made statements when she wanted to give Sophia space to hear herself. There is still work, Sophia said. There are follow-up questions on the contract. There are always follow-up questions, Nina said. That's not why you're staying. Sophia looked out the window. A delivery truck was making its way up the narrow street below. The driver was arguing with someone on his phone, while simultaneously making hand gestures at a car that was parked too close to the curb. Milan in the morning. No, she agreed. It's not why I'm staying. She flew to Palermo 4 days later. This was not Dante's idea. He had not suggested it, and had not pushed for it. He had, on their second evening together in Milan, a dinner that ran until nearly midnight, and covered topics that moved between the practical and the personal, so smoothly she could not always trace the seam, mentioned that the main offices of Mancuso Group were in Palermo, and that if she had further questions about the contract documentation, she was welcome to come there and review the original files. His tone had been entirely professional. His eyes had said something slightly different. She had booked the flight herself. She had packed for a week, and told herself she was packing for 3 days. She had not told her mother, who would have had questions she was not ready to answer. Palermo met her the way Palermo met everyone, loudly, warmly, with total confidence that it was the most important place you had ever arrived. The airport smelled of coffee and engine fuel, and the particular dryness of Sicilian summer air, and when she stepped outside into the heat, she felt something move in her chest that she could not immediately identify. Then she identified it. Recognition. She had never been to Sicily. She had been born in New Jersey. She had grown up in New Jersey. Her grandmother's kitchen was the only piece of this island she had ever touched. But the light, the specific weight and color of the light, the way it fell on yellow stone, the way it held heat, was the light her grandmother had described so many times, while standing at a stove that it had become part of her internal landscape without her ever setting foot here. She stood outside the arrivals hall for a full minute, just breathing it. A car was waiting for her. A driver who gave his name as Mark, said nothing else beyond directions to the seatbelt, and drove with the quiet competence of someone who had done this route many times. He took her through the city, and she watched Palermo come at her through the car window. The chaos, and the beauty, and the history, all compressed together, the streets too narrow for modern traffic, the buildings carrying centuries in their walls, the markets spilling out onto pavements, and everywhere the noise and smell and gorgeous unreasonable energy of a place that had been absorbing the world and refusing to be absorbed for 3,000 years. The car stopped at a house in the older part of the city. It was not what she had imagined. She had imagined something guarded, something with gates and cameras, and the visible architecture of security that men in Dante's position usually surrounded themselves with. There was a gate, and she noticed the camera above it, and the man who opened the gate had the contained stillness she was beginning to recognize as belonging to people who worked close to Dante. But beyond that, the house was simply old. The courtyard was full of afternoon light and the sound of a small fountain. The stone walls had been repaired over centuries rather than replaced, and you could read the different eras in the way the stone changed color in layers, and there were pots of orange trees along the wall that smelled extraordinary in the heat. A woman named Julia met her at the door. She was somewhere in her 60s, with the posture of someone who had run households longer than Sophia had been alive. She showed Sophia to a room that had a view of the courtyard and high ceilings and shutters that kept the room cool. She said lunch would be at 2, that Dante was currently in meetings, and that she was welcome to anything she needed. This last part was said with the warmth of a person who meant it, which was not always the case when people said it. Sophia unpacked. She sat by the window. She listened to the fountain. She was in the house of a man she had known for less than a week, in a city she had never been to, having stayed past her flight home for reasons she was still only partially honest with herself about. She opened her laptop and worked. This was how she managed herself in uncertain situations. She worked. She had always been this way. When her father had been ill, 3 years ago, she had translated a 200-page legal brief in 4 days, because it was something she could do well, and doing it well had been the one thing she could control. She had made coffee and sat at the hospital waiting room table and worked, and her mother had looked at her sideways, and she had kept working because it was better than the alternative. She worked until 5. Then she went downstairs and walked around the courtyard and stood beside the orange trees and let the smell of them do whatever it was doing to her. "You're still here." She turned. Dante had come into the courtyard from a door she had not noticed. He was in a different suit than the one he had worn in Milan. Darker, simpler, more at home on him somehow. He looked less like a man on business travel and more like himself. She noticed this. She noticed that she already had some sense of what himself looked like, which meant she had been paying closer attention than she had acknowledged. "I said I would come," she said. "You did." He looked at her in the way he had looked at her in the restaurant, attentive, direct, without any of the performance that most people wrapped around a long look. "How was the flight?" "Short. The drive was better." He nodded. He walked to the orange trees and stood beside one and looked at the courtyard rather than at her. "My grandfather planted these," he said. He said orange trees were the only honest thing in Sicily. Everything else was complicated. "Your grandfather sounds like my grandmother," she said. He looked at her then. What did she say? She thought for a moment, found the phrase in the dialect, said it. He was still for a second. Then he repeated it, quietly, under his breath. His pronunciation was slightly different from hers, a small regional variation that she would not have caught if she had not grown up inside the sound of it. She said so. He looked at her with an expression that she was not going to let herself interpret too quickly. "My grandmother said it the same way yours did," he said. "The Western pronunciation. My grandfather said the Eastern way." "They argued about it," she said immediately. It was not a guess. He laughed. Actually laughed. A short, real sound that lasted only a moment, but changed the whole quality of the evening air. "Every Sunday," he said. "My grandfather said the Eastern pronunciation was more correct. My grandmother said that was what someone said when they were wrong." Sophia pressed her lips together to contain something that wanted to be a smile. Correct, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. The fountain made its small, consistent sound in the corner of the courtyard. The light was moving through that late afternoon change that happened in southern places, thinning toward gold. Why did you really come? He said. Direct. Always direct. She had noticed this in Milan, and she noticed it again now. He did not circle things. He went to the center and waited there. She had prepared an answer. She had prepared a professional answer, and a deflecting answer, and a version of the truth that was partial enough to be safe. In the preparation, she had told herself she would use one of those. She used none of them. You heard me, she said, at the restaurant. The first night, I was saying something I thought no one would hear, and you heard it. He said nothing. He was listening. I have spent 12 years translating things for other people, she said. I have sat in rooms where I was the only thread, and I have held things together with words, and I am very good at it. But I say things to myself, in the dialect in my grandmother's voice, and no one has ever heard. Not in a way that mattered. She paused. You turned around. The courtyard was quiet. You came all the way to Palermo for that, he said. Quietly, not mocking, trying to understand exactly. I came all the way to Palermo, she said, because I wanted to hear it again. The way you said those two words. In that language. I wanted to hear what it sounded like coming from someone who actually knew where it was from. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said something in the dialect. A full sentence, unhurried, in his grandfather's Eastern pronunciation. It was a statement, not a question. It said, some things take their time arriving. She knew the phrase. It was something old people said about patience. Her grandmother had used it once, about bread that needed longer to rise. She answered him in the Western pronunciation, the way her grandmother would have. He looked away toward the orange trees, and she saw the line of his jaw move slightly, and she understood without any doubt that this man, who had been unmoved by everything she had seen him encounter, was moved by this, not overwhelmed, not undone, simply touched, in the way that real things touch people when they are not prepared for them. Come to dinner, he said, looking at the trees. Julia makes something on Thursdays that I have been eating for 35 years. What is it? I don't know the name in English. In the dialect it's called. He said a word she recognized, a thing her grandmother had made in autumn with chickpeas, and something bitter, and a great deal of olive oil. I know what that is, she said. He turned and looked at her. I know, he said, and his voice was different, not softer. He was not a soft man, but closer to something true. She followed him inside, into the old stone house that smelled of cooking, and lemon polish, and centuries of people living in the same walls, and the evening opened up in front of her like a page she had not yet read. The dinner was extraordinary. Julia brought things to the table without ceremony, one after another, with the confidence of someone who had been cooking this way her entire life, and knew exactly what she was doing, and felt no need to announce it. They ate in a room that looked onto the courtyard, and the conversation moved. From the food, to the history of the house, to Palermo itself, to the question of what gets passed down through families without anyone deciding to pass it down. My mother never spoke the dialect, Dante said. She thought it was backward. She wanted Italian, proper Italian. She was embarrassed by the village. My mother was the same, Sophia said. My grandmother would speak it, and my mother would answer in English. They had whole conversations that way, each one refusing the other's language. But you learned it. I sat at the table long enough, she said. You absorb things without meaning to. He was looking at her. That is exactly what happened to me, he said. Exactly. My grandmother would talk, and I would pretend to be busy with something else, and the whole time it was going into me. Something about the way he said it, the specificity of it, the accuracy, made her feel seen in a way that was uncomfortable and necessary at the same time, like a window being opened in a room that had been closed for a long time. You needed the air, and the air was cold. After dinner, he showed her the library. It was in a room off the main hall, with bookshelves from floor to ceiling, and a table in the center that looked like it had been used for serious work for a very long time. The books were in multiple languages. She moved along the shelves reading spines, and he watched her do it, with his hands in his pockets, and the quiet of a man who is comfortable being watched while being still. She stopped at a particular shelf, a row of books, old ones, in French. She pulled one out and looked at it. "You read Montaigne," she said. "When I travel," he said. "He is good company on long flights. He wrote about the difficulty of knowing yourself," she said, "that it was the hardest work a person could do." "Yes," Dante said. "I find it useful to be reminded of that." She looked at him over the book. "Why?" she said. He met her eyes. "Because," he said, "in my position, most people tell you what you want to hear. It becomes very easy to stop questioning yourself. Montaigne does not tell you what you want to hear." She put the book back. She looked at the shelf. She said, without turning around, "Neither did I. At the restaurant. The first night." Behind her, he was quiet for a moment. "No," he said, "you did not." She turned. He was closer than she expected. Not close in a way that was forward or deliberate. Simply close. The way a room shifts when you have been talking honestly in it long enough that the distance between people stops feeling like a statement. "That was the first interesting thing that had happened to me in a very long time," he said. She looked at him. "Being insulted," she said. "Being seen," he said. "Without permission, without warning, in a language that means something." He held her gaze. "That is a very rare thing." The library was quiet. The courtyard fountain was far enough away that it was only a presence, not a sound. Somewhere in the house, Julia was moving, doing whatever Julia did after dinner, and the sound of it was the sound of an ordinary evening in an old house. And standing here in the middle of it, Sophia felt something settle in her that had been unsettled for a long time. Not certainty, not safety, something more honest than either of those things. She felt exactly where she was. She felt the room and the language and the man in front of her, and the particular truth that she had come here for something she could not have named before she arrived, and could name precisely now. She had come here to find out if the thing she had felt in that restaurant was real. It was real. The next 3 weeks were the strangest of her life. Not because they were turbulent. They were not, on the surface. They had the quality, those 3 weeks, of something very still, over something moving very fast underneath, and she was aware of both at the same time constantly. She stayed in the house in Palermo. She told herself each day that she would decide about leaving the next day, and each next day arrived and she did not leave, and eventually she stopped framing it as a decision and simply stayed. She worked in the mornings from the library. Dante was in meetings most days until early afternoon. She could hear the low register of voices from the other end of the house, could sense the contained activity of a place that had real business occurring in it, though she never saw it directly. He was careful about that, she noticed. In the afternoons they walked. Palermo had a particular energy in the late afternoon, when the heat began to soften and the streets filled and the markets were still going, and the light turned everything amber and unhurried. He knew the city the way people know things they have never had to learn, completely, without maps, as extension of self. He took her through streets she could not have found again without him, and showed her things without performing the showing of them. A doorway from the 12th century tucked between 2 modern storefronts. A courtyard that you could only see if you knew which door to try. A church that was Arab and Norman and Byzantine all at once, because the island had been everyone's island at different times, and had absorbed all of them, and belonged entirely to itself. My grandmother used to say that Sicily had been conquered so many times that it finally decided to conquer its conquerors, Sophia said one afternoon, standing in the middle of a piazza that felt like standing in 4 centuries simultaneously. Mine said the same thing, Dante said. Different words, same argument. Their grandmothers probably said it to each other, Sophia said, in the same kitchen. He looked at her sideways, something in his expression that she had started to recognize, a warmth that he did not display openly, that lived in the slight softening around his eyes rather than in any movement of his mouth. She had started to read him the way she read difficult texts, with the full attention of someone who understood that meaning lived between the lines as much as in them. He was a complicated man. She did not shy away from this. She had understood it from the beginning and had chosen to be here anyway, and the choosing was something she sat with directly, rather than sliding past it, because she was not a person who got to pretend she did not know things. She knew what his company was. She knew what the men who worked around him were there for. She knew that the life she was sitting inside for these 3 weeks was constructed on foundations that she could not fully see and had not been invited to examine. She knew all of this. She did not stop knowing it on any of the days she stayed. She called Nina on the 10th day. "How are you?" Nina said. The way she said it meant, "Tell me the actual thing." "Confused," Sophia said, which was honest. "Happy," also confused. "Those are often the same thing," Nina said. "He is—" She stopped, started again. "He is not what I expected. I keep expecting something and he keeps being something else. Something better or something worse. Something more," she said. "Just more." Nina was quiet for a moment. Then, "Sophia, you know what his world is." "I know. You've read the same things I've read." "I know. And—" She looked out the library window at the courtyard, where the orange trees were doing their steady, uncomplicated work in the afternoon sun. "And I'm still here," she said. The call ended without resolution. She had not expected resolution. She had called Nina because she needed to hear herself say the things out loud to a person who would not accept a softened version. What she had said out loud was the truth. She was still here, and the reasons she was still here were real and complicated and did not resolve neatly, and she was someone who dealt in language and knew exactly what it meant when something resisted easy translation. It meant the thing was real. There was one evening, the 14th day, though she had stopped counting and had to reconstruct it later, when they sat on the roof terrace after dinner, and the city was spread out below them doing what it did at night, and they had been talking for 2 hours about something that had started as a question about language and moved through history and memory, and had arrived somewhere neither of them had navigated toward deliberately. He had been quiet for a little while, not uncomfortably. They had gotten to the point where silence between them was a different kind of conversation. Then he said, "I need to tell you something." She waited. "The contract in Milan," he said. "Colin did not arrange that independently." She looked at the city. "You arranged it," she said. Yes. She had known this. She had known it since the morning after the restaurant, when she had sat with the cold coffee and run the sequence backward, and understood that the precision of it, the restaurant, the timing, Colin's involvement, was not the shape of a coincidence. She had known it, and had filed it somewhere in herself, and had not taken it out and examined it, because examining it meant having a conversation she was not sure she was ready to have. She was ready now. "Why?" she said. He was quiet for a moment, not evasive, thinking. He was always precise about what he said. She had noticed this across every conversation they had shared. He thought before he spoke. He used words like instruments. "After the restaurant," he said. "The first night, when you said what you said. When I insulted you. When you spoke," he said, and his voice was careful, in a language that I thought I had lost. I had not heard it, really heard it, naturally, the way you spoke it, since my grandmother died. He was looking at the city. I wanted to hear it again. "So you engineered a contract review," she said. "Yes." She turned this over. "That is a significant amount of effort," she said, "for a conversation." "I have found," he said, "that the things worth having require significant effort. And if I had not come to Palermo," she said, "if I had done the contract review in Milan and gone home, I would have found another reason," he said, simply, without drama. "I would have kept finding reasons until you came, or until you made it clear you did not want to." She looked at him. He looked back. That direct, steady gaze that she had decided in the first week was not a power performance. It was simply how he looked at things that mattered to him, fully, without deflection. "You should have told me," she said. "Yes. That's a serious thing to do." "Yes," he said again. "I know that. I am telling you now because I do not want to be someone who deceives you. Even when the deception was—" He paused, choosing, "in service of something real." She thought about her grandmother, who had come to New Jersey with nothing but a dialect and a stubbornness that could have ground stone, who had made a life out of sheer refusal to be anything other than exactly herself, who had sat in that kitchen for 40 years, saying exactly what she thought in a language no one around her fully understood. "What do you want?" Sophia said. "From this. From me." He was quiet for a moment. She could hear the city below. "I want," he started, then stopped. "There are things I can offer," he said carefully, "and things I cannot change about my life. I am not going to ask you to accept something I have not shown you fully. That is not honest." "Tell me what you can't change," she said. He told her. He was direct and unhurried, and he did not soften anything. He told her about the company, the full company, not the press filing version of it, not everything, because some things could not be said aloud, but enough. He told her about the obligations that had existed in his family for generations, and which he had inherited, and which were not a choice in the way that most choices are choices. He told her about the decisions he had made to move certain things toward legitimate ground, and how long that had taken, and how much further there was still to go. He told her what security looked like for people close to him, and what that meant practically. He told her what she would have to stop asking about, not because he would stop her, but because some things could not be part of the conversation, and he needed her to understand that. He talked for a long time. She listened. She did not interrupt. When he was done, she sat with it all for several minutes. He let her. He did not fill the silence. He looked at the city. "You're telling me this now," she said eventually, "because you want me to make a real decision." "Yes," he said. "Not a decision based on 3 weeks of," she gestured at the house, the city, the orange trees, all of it. "Not a decision based on any of this," he said. "A decision based on what I have just told you." She stood up. She walked to the edge of the terrace and looked out over Palermo. The light spread to the dark line of the sea. In the distance she could see the mountains, black shapes against a slightly lighter sky. This island her grandmother had left at 22 and never returned to, and here she was, standing on its roof, looking at its dark mountains, and feeling something in her chest that was inconvenient and necessary, and absolutely not going away. She thought about language, about what it meant to find the right word for a thing, about how most emotions did not have one word, they had a shape, and you found your way around the shape with several words until the shape was clear. She thought about what Dante had told her. She did not minimize it. She did not make it smaller than it was. She held the full weight of it, and stood with it, the way her grandmother had stood with hard things, directly, without theatrics, with the stubbornness that was apparently a family trait. "I need time," she said. "Yes," he said, "of course. Real time. Not days. Weeks, maybe. Yes." She turned and looked at him. He was still in the chair, still and unhurried, and looking at her with an expression that was, she understood now, the expression of a man who had been very careful for a very long time, and was doing the dangerous thing of being careful with something that mattered. "While I am taking time," she said, "I am going home." He nodded. "And I am going to think about this honestly," she said, "not about the house and the orange trees and the dialect, the actual thing you told me tonight." "Yes," he said, "that is what I want you to think about." She looked at him for a long moment. "And you won't," she started. "I will wait," he said, "however long it takes." She believed him. Not because he was trustworthy in the conventional uncomplicated sense. She was not naive about that. She believed him because she had spent 3 weeks learning to read him, and she was very good at reading things, and what she read in him now was the absolute truth of it. She went to her room. She did not sleep for a long time. She lay in the room with the courtyard shutters slightly open, and listened to the fountain and the night sounds of the city, and she thought about her grandmother leaving at 22, with a dialect and a temper, and she thought about what leaving required, and what staying required, and which of those was the braver thing. She did not have an answer yet, but she knew, lying in that room, that for the first time in a very long time, the question was completely real. She packed in the morning. Julia brought coffee without being asked. Dante was already up. She found him in the courtyard with the orange trees and a cup of his own, and the early light doing what it did in this city, arriving without apology, expecting to be received. She said goodbye with the restraint of someone who understood that the real goodbye was the decision she had not yet made. He said it back with the restraint of someone who understood the same thing. She got into Mark's car and watched the old house get smaller in the window, the courtyard wall, the orange trees just visible above it, and then the street turned and it was gone. She was on the plane before she let herself feel any of it. At 35,000 feet, flying north, she opened her notebook, the real one, paper, the one she had carried since university, and she wrote one word, her grandmother's word, the dialect word for the feeling of recognizing something you have never seen before. She stared at it for a long time. Then she closed the notebook and looked at the clouds and thought, honestly, about what she was going to do. She was in New York for 19 days. She counted them later, looking back, trying to understand the shape of those weeks, what they felt like from the inside, compared to what they must have looked like from the outside. From the outside, she was probably living normally. She went to her apartment in Brooklyn and opened the windows and bought groceries and checked her email and took 3 new translation jobs that were short and straightforward and required only the surface part of her brain, which was the only part she could spare. From the inside, she was somewhere between 2 places constantly. She called her mother on the 3rd day, sat in the kitchen with tea going cold the way tea always went cold in this apartment. She was not a person who managed to drink things at the right temperature when she was thinking, and talked around everything while her mother talked about the usual things, the neighbor, the garden, a cousin who was getting married, and at the end of the call her mother said, without any particular change of tone, "You sound like you're somewhere else." "I'm in Brooklyn," Sophia said. Said her mother, which meant, "That's not what I said." She did not call Nina again right away. She needed to sit with it without interpretation. Nina was a lawyer and a good friend and a brilliant person to have in your corner when you needed to understand a situation clearly. But what Sophia needed right now was not clarity imposed from outside. She needed to arrive at it herself, which was slower and messier, and the only way it would hold. She walked a lot. Brooklyn in late summer was its own instruction in being alive. The heat sitting in the streets, the trees thick and dark, the noise of the neighborhood coming through open windows and off stoops, and out of restaurants with their doors propped open. She walked and she thought, and she did not hurry the thinking, because she was her grandmother's granddaughter, and her grandmother had never done anything in a hurry that was worth doing slowly. She thought about what Dante had told her on the terrace. She did not make it neat. She sat with the parts of it that were hard, and the parts of it that were harder, and the parts that were hardest of all, which were not the parts she had expected. The parts she had expected to trouble her most, the nature of the business, the obligations inherited from his family, the things she would never be allowed to ask about. Those were present, and she did not minimize them, but they were not the part that kept her awake. She had known the shape of those things before she went to Palermo. She had gone to Palermo knowing. The part that kept her awake was simpler and more honest than any of the rest of it. She was afraid of wanting something this much. She had not wanted anything this directly in a long time. She had built a good life in the gap between languages, in the work of carrying meaning from one world to another, and the life was real and she valued it. But there was a way she had arranged it, without ever deciding to, so that the things she wanted most were always at a slight angle, wanted but not pursued, reached for but not committed to, because wanting things completely was the fastest route to losing them completely, and she had learned this early, and had been careful since. She had not been careful in Palermo. She had sat in a library with a man who read Montaigne in French for company, and spoken to him in her grandmother's language, and allowed herself to be completely where she was, completely present, without the slight angle. And she had loved it. That was the word she was sitting with. Not about the man, not yet. Not in a way she was ready to name out loud. About the experience. About the feeling of being entirely in a place and a conversation, without managing her distance from it. She had loved it with a completeness that frightened her, and the fear was not about him or his world, but about what it meant that she had felt that way, because feeling that way meant she had not been feeling it before, and now she had to live knowing the difference. On the 8th day, she called her mother back. Not to tell her, to talk, to sit with her in the usual way, on the phone, with the tea going cold, and hear her mother's voice doing its familiar things. And in the middle of a conversation about something completely ordinary, her mother said, as though the thought had just arrived, "Your grandmother always said that the right thing never arrived at a convenient time." Sophia was quiet for a moment. "She said a lot of things," Sophia said carefully. "She said that one a lot," her mother said. "Whenever I tried to tell her the timing wasn't right for something, she would make that sound she made. You know the sound. And say that in the dialect." Sophia knew the saying. She had heard it in the kitchen 100 times. "The timing is not the thing." "Why are you telling me this?" Sophia said. "I'm not telling you anything," her mother said peacefully. "I was remembering your grandmother. That's all." It was not all. Her mother was not a subtle woman, but she was a precise one, and she chose what she remembered aloud with the same care other people chose what they said directly. Sophia let it sit. On the 11th day, she opened her notebook to the words she had written on the plane. She had not opened the notebook since she wrote it. She had been carrying it in her bag, aware of it the way you are aware of something unresolved that you are not yet ready to resolve. She looked at the word, the dialect word for recognizing something you have never seen before. She had heard her grandmother use it once, about a photograph, an old photograph of the village, taken before her grandmother was born, that someone had sent her in a letter. Conchetta had looked at it for a long time, and then put her hand flat on the table and said that word, half to herself, half to the room. Sophia had asked her what it meant. Her grandmother had thought about it for a moment, and then said, in English, for once, because the translation required English, "It means you know something you have not met yet." She closed the notebook. She picked up her phone. She had not spoken to Dante since the morning she left. He had not called. He had not sent messages. He had said he would wait, and he was waiting, and the absence of pressure was its own kind of pressure, because it required her to make the decision without being pushed toward it, which was the harder thing. She held the phone for a long time. Then she did not call. She booked a flight instead. She did not think about it for a long time before she booked it. She had done the thinking. The thinking was done. What remained was the decision itself, which was separate from the thinking, which lived not in the part of her that analyzed, but in the part that knew. She packed one bag. She called Nina. "I'm going back," she said. Nina was quiet for a moment. Then, "Okay. That's all you're going to say." "What do you want me to say?" Nina said. "Tell me I'm making a mistake." "I don't think you are," Nina said. "I think you have thought about this more honestly than most people think about anything, and I think you know what you're doing." "I'm not sure about that." "I know," Nina said. "That's why it's real." She flew overnight. She slept for 4 hours and spent the remaining 2 hours watching the dark below the plane and thinking about her grandmother on a boat going the other direction, all those decades ago, leaving the island at 22, with a particular stubbornness and a dialect and no plan, except to find something worth building. She landed in Palermo in the early morning. The light was the same, that specific weight of it, the quality that she had felt in her chest when she arrived the first time, and that hit her again now with the same force. The recognition of something she carried internally, finally meeting the external thing it had always been made from. She did not tell Dante she was coming. This was deliberate. She had thought about it and decided that arriving without announcement was the truest version of it. No drama built around it, no prepared moment. She would arrive. She would see him as he actually was in an ordinary moment, rather than a prepared one. The decision she had made deserved the real version, not a staged one. She took a taxi from the airport. She told the driver the address. She watched the city come back to her. The streets, the noise, the heat already building, the smell of it, the extraordinary, unreasonable beauty of a place that did not apologize for being exactly what it was. The car stopped outside the gate. She paid and got out and stood on the street with her bag and looked at the old stone wall. The gate opened before she reached it. The same man, the same stillness, the same careful eyes. He looked at her for a moment. Then he stepped back. She walked into the courtyard. It was early enough that the light was still low and sideways, and the orange trees were catching it in a way that made them look like they were lit from within. The fountain was going. The stone was cool. The house was quiet in the way that houses are quiet before the day starts, with all of it still gathered. She set her bag down beside one of the orange trees and stood there. She heard the door. She turned. He was in the doorway. He had clearly been up for a while. He was dressed, the particular alertness of a man who started his days early. He had a coffee cup in one hand. He looked at her across the courtyard with the expression of someone who is seeing something they were not sure would arrive. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The fountain went on with its small, consistent work. Then she spoke. In the dialect. In her grandmother's voice. In Conchetta's voice. The Western pronunciation. The Mazzarino sound. Low and direct and without any softness to it. The way her grandmother had said the name of anything she had decided was hers. She said his name. She said it the way you say the name of something that has been yours for a long time, and you are simply now saying it aloud for the first time. He looked at her from across the courtyard. He set the coffee cup down on the ledge beside the door. He was still for a moment, the way he was still before he moved. Deliberate, complete. Then he smiled. The same smile as the restaurant. The first night. The slow one that reached his eyes before it moved anywhere else. The one that carried something inside it she had spent weeks learning to read and now knew the name of. He crossed the courtyard. He stopped in front of her, close, and looked at her with the full attention she had come to understand was how he looked at everything that mattered to him. Directly, without the slight angle, with nothing held back. He said her name back, in the same dialect, in the Eastern way, the way his grandfather had said it, the way his grandmother had corrected. Neither of them moved for a moment. You came back, he said. Say that again, she said. He understood the reference immediately. She saw it in his eyes, the flash of something real, something that landed all the way down. He said her name again, in the dialect. Both pronunciations this time, East and West, the way two people from the same village say the same thing differently, and are both correct. She looked at him. The orange trees held their light in the early morning. The fountain made its small sound. The old stone walls stood the way they had stood for centuries, having absorbed every version of everything that had ever happened inside them. And this was one more version. One more morning. One more moment of someone arriving at something they had been moving toward without knowing it. She had spent her adult life in the space between languages. She had carried meaning from one side to another, had stood in the gap and held things together, had been the thread. She was good at it. She valued it. It was real work, and it was her work. But the word for what she felt standing in that courtyard, the specific word, the precise word, existed only in the dialect. Her grandmother's word. His grandmother's word. The word from a village that 4,000 people in the world still knew, and that had traveled through 2 families across 2 oceans, across 2 generations, and arrived, intact, in this courtyard, in this morning light. She did not say it. She did not need to. They both already knew it. That was the thing about sharing a language. You did not always have to speak.